Barry Risk spent 35 years working for Canada Customs. That nearly 4 decades in the job has given him a unique view on our border and what he sees as the gradual erosion of Canada's border security. And Barry Risk joins us now from the nation's capital for more. Good to have you on the program tonight, Mr. Risk. How are you?
Fine, Steve. Thank you for having me. Please
Not at
call
all.
me Barry.
If you insist. Okay, Barry, where are you from originally?
I was born in Bristol, England,
So
but now I've been a Canadian citizen for...
How'd you end up over here?
Like most immigrants after the war, my parents came here to set up family, and here I am.
Here you are indeed. You did 35 years at Canada Customs, and I wonder what it was about Canada's border protection that you found so fascinating back in the middle 70s that made you want to sign up.
Well, I had a luck. As a youth, I joined a thing called COMEX, stands for Commonwealth Expedition. And I had the opportunity to drive from London, England to India and back. And as you can appreciate, you cross many, many borders. So that was, I think, my James Burke connection moment.
Okay, that was the moment. And then when you got to Canada and you realized what the gig was about, what did you find appealing about it?
Well, the job has been a career for me, Steve. It's the opportunity to interact with people on a tremendous rate. Most people don't understand or have the concept of how many people cross that border annually. And I had an opportunity, worked my way up from a uniformed officer to what's a superintendent to a chief, and then onwards to the headquarters here in Ottawa.
Well, let's get into this a bit because, and you'll forgive the question because I know you've had it before. You won't be surprised to hear me say that my hunch is when people see you folks do the jobs that you do, our first impression is not to say, oh, aren't you wonderful? Our first impression is to say, why are you delaying getting me where I want to go? What's the answer to that question?
Well, the intent of my book, which we discussed, Steve, was to actually inform the Canadian public about the whys and what we do. Why do we interview you in a triage type of environment called primary at an airport or when your car pulls up to the border? How long does it take? What is the reality of it? And more often than not, once I've had the opportunity to speak to the public, they're very understanding of it. You somehow can say to a Canadian, how much time are you willing to invest in your sovereignty? For that is exactly what customs and border protection is about, sovereignty of this country.
Sovereignty or security?
Well, it started out as sovereignty. Yes, security has taken a priority, but I think that sovereignty captures security as well.
When you have that encounter at the border, just give me some insight here into, are you literally, the second your eyes come upon the person that you're dealing with, evaluating them?
Yes, Steve, that's correct, although we have many other opportunities, both in the computerized world where we get passenger lists, what we call tombstone data, your birth date, this sort of thing. But for the most part, the analytical part, the quick triage that occurs when you meet a primary officer starts with that interaction, the presentation of the passport, sometimes the presentation of your air ticket and so forth. The officer, male and female, are actually trying to capture what we call indicators. Is this person a legitimate traveler? At the same time, we're trying to meet our obligations. For Customs enforces between 70 and 90 acts of Parliament. So we also meet our obligations for immigration, we meet our obligations for agriculture, all the other departments which provide laws that Customs is responsible to enforce. All this within a 32 to 47 second process.
It's a lot to figure out, admittedly, in a relatively short space of time, but you talked about these indicators that you're looking for, such as what?
Well, if you forgive me, maybe an example would be the best bet to show, what is the norm. If you had in front of you in a hot July in Canada, a young lady who just flew back from Jamaica, shall we say, she had paid cash for a ticket and she's wearing a fur coat. Is this out of the norm? Are we seeing something that is not the usual for the Canadian traveler? Doesn't generally go to Jamaica in July, usually pays with a credit card 30, 40, 60 days in advance, and definitely doesn't bring back a fur coat. So we have indicators that this person is out of the norm. It does not mean that she's committed some crime. It means that we have indicators to justify further investigation. And this person may be sent to what is known as customs secondary. Again, not that she's committed anything wrong, but she has these out of the norm signs. Well, an investigation could very quickly find that a grandmother passed away and she had to rush. They had to pay cash for a ticket. And while she was down there, she inherited a fur coat, which she couldn't carry in her bag. Makes sense. It's doable, but we had to do the investigation anyway.
What's the more nefarious indication?
More nefarious indication. There are multiple.
No. I mean, in that example, in that example, you gave an explanation that's really quite benign. But if you were going to go the other way and find an explanation that's potentially illegal, how does that story normally end?
Well, that can end with finding drugs, because Jamaica is a drug source country, one of multitudes throughout Central South America, the Caribbean. All those would generate a further investigation. That further investigation could lead to all sorts of other questions and a baggage search, which would then could come across other indicators of that she's a drug courier or money laundering or so forth and so on.
Gotcha.
But
now,
one builds on the other.
I understand. There's nothing particularly unique about somebody trying to smuggle drugs across the border, but I bet you've seen your share of very odd things being smuggled across. What's the craziest thing you saw somebody try to bring over?
Well, believe it or not, one of the most expensive things that I saw smuggled, which was actually worth more than drugs, was bull semen.
I'm sorry?
Smuggled into Toronto.
For what?
For use on a farm. Didn't want to, but it was smuggled, worth millions of dollars, literally in a vacuum container.
And what did you do in that case?
Well, of course, we're the primary investigators. We capture it, and then we call in our agricultural inspectors, our CFIA, in this, as it's now called, and they would continue on with doing what's necessary, i.e. the failure to declare it, the failure to declare the value, so forth and so on, until it's determined that criminal prosecution may occur.
Gotcha. Let's talk about something that I've heard referred to as Fortress North America. You know, in this post-9/11 world in which we live, we hear more and more voices calling for a so-called Fortress North America around Canada, the United States, and Mexico. Some kind of shared border, perimeter, security, that kind of thing. What's your view on that idea?
Well, Steve, the Fortress North America would be modeled, as you can appreciate, on what is already in place, which is Fortress Europe. The EU, as you know, if you were to fly into Paris today, you would be in Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, Denmark. You would not be subject to a immigration or customs check at all those land borders. Once you're inside the perimeter, you're within the full aspects of the EU. The problem with that concept, though, is it's only as strong as its weakest link. Its weakest link right now lies within Italy, Spain, Portugal, mostly due to their how close they are to the North African coast. You've probably followed in the news the loss of literally thousands of immigrants, refugees trying to cross the Mediterranean. But once they are in, once they're able to break in through the rocky coasts of Portugal, Spain, Italy, whatever, they're not just in those countries, they're in Europe. Now, one of the challenges that Canada will be facing in the near future is the environmental refugee. If you were to take a band around the earthquake of, let's say, 100, 200 miles, you'll note that the fires in California, fires in Greece, Italy, people are migrating to water. So if you take this fortress concept, when we lose our border control to this and go to the perimeter, we lose our ability to have a layered defense. And again, if you'll bear with me, I'll give you an example. When I was a young superintendent at Ottawa International Airport, McDonald-Cartier, we had a flight from Colombia. You can appreciate that's a very big drug source country at the time. Cocaine was wild in Florida and so forth. But that flight had to go through Miami first and was subject to U.S. customs and immigration clearance. Now, that's not to say that they got every bad guy that came off the flight, and we had our share. But it was a layered defense. The person had to go through first U.S. and then Canada. You remove that layered defense, you no longer have the ability to enforce Canadian law or the ability to stop it. In other words, once the person's, in the case of Fortress America, is in the United States, he's in Canada. So a Guatemalan, a Honduran, a Nicaraguan moving north, as I explained, the environmental refugee, if the most powerful nation in the world, the United States, cannot stop refugees going into Arizona now, you can appreciate that if that Honduran gets into Arizona, he's in Alberta the next day, or Ontario. So that is my major concern with, sorry.
I appreciate that. So, but you referred, in giving the European example, to the weakest link, and you named a number of countries. Looking at the North American, so-called Fortress North American example, who's the weakest link over here?
If you were to include Mexico, I don't think there's much doubt that it lies there. The turmoil that the government is going through, the amount of drug cartels along their borders, there's no doubt there. I mean, drugs are pouring through Mexico now, never mind if they were to take responsibility. But even, as I said, the border between the United States and Mexico has been sliced and diced, for want of a better term. And, you know, the concerns that the Obama regime has been dealing with on that problem and trying to get a new immigration law through. So if we go to a perimeter and we remove our land border between the United States, then once they're in Arizona, as I say, they're in Quebec, they're in Ontario, they're wherever they can get in. A major concern.
I suspected you were going to say Mexico, but I wanted to get you saying it on the record just so there was no misunderstanding, because I suspect the Mexicans would be looking at our northernmost border, noticing that the ice is melting a lot, noticing that the Northwest Passage is experiencing significantly increased traffic, and probably legitimately asking the question, okay, Canadians, are you so sure that your Canadian Border Services has got the North in hand?
And that would
What's the answer?
That would be a very valid question. Although we have played a role in the North, we've had officers stationed up in Iqaluit, or then known as Frobisher Bay, and Tuktoyaktuk in certain times. But for the most part, it is an open door. And it has been used from time to time. When I was an operational officer, by accident, we were to find out that an aircraft had landed in Tuktoyaktuk doing cold testing on Volkswagens, and nobody knew that it had arrived in Canada or had been authorized. So yes, it has been tested. Will we step up to the plate? If the government so authorizes us, of course we would. We have people in places like the Alaska-Yukon border and Little Gold Creek and Beaver Creek. These are pretty hard postings. So we're prepared. We've got the ability. We're just not doing it. And the northern border could open very quickly on us.
Barry, you mentioned the government, and I just want to spend a minute asking you about that. There's some obvious built-in tension between any government of the day and the Canadian Border Service Agency. And I just wonder how you would characterize the relationship between this federal Conservative government and the current leadership and the membership of the agency today.
Well, I don't know if I would isolate the Conservatives necessarily, but I think there's been a fundamental change dealing with all the public service, but CBSA particularly. When I again came as a young officer up to headquarters, it amazed me how close I was to the top. I answered to a manager to a director, director general to assistant commissioner, commissioner to minister. So we're talking 5, 6 levels. And at that time, one of our jobs was to consult with the minister, act as advisor to the minister. So if a constituent in his riding or an MP's riding would come down with some idea, it would come to us and we would either say, it's a good idea, we'll look at it, or B, Mr. Minister, we've already gone down this road, so forth and so on, and handled it. So there was the triumvirate, for want of a better term, the public putting in their ideas, the minister representing the political want, and CBS Customs at the time. That has changed. We're no longer consulted. Whatever has political optics is sent down the line, and you will make it work. And you cannot stop them. You say, no, we've done this, and we've spent a lot of money and made a lot of mistakes. So we are no longer a partner anymore, but merely a doer.
And I presume you think that's worse.
I do, because we've had experience and depth developed that we can apply. And there are some great ideas that the public supply, but there are also some ideas that just have to be sorted out. When I was chief up in the Sault Ste. Marie, for example, I was approached by the Petroleum Association, and they actually wanted us, during cross-border shopping, to measure the amount of gas in Canadian cars going out, and then measure the gas coming back, and charge them duties and taxes on the difference. Can you imagine how much that would tie up the border?
Indeed. Barry Risk, it's awfully good of you to share your experiences with us on TVO tonight. Thanks so much for joining us from Ottawa.
Thank you for having me.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.